with a hyper focus, how would someone go about doing that? Like, I think everyone wants hyper focus at the end of the day,
Yeah,
but it's like, it's not easy to attain.
totally.
So how do you best put yourself in that situation? Is it really just a convincing yourself, look, I just need to do this, and I need to just go through that resistance for a little bit, and then I'll get into it? Because I feel like there's a lot of people, including myself, like sometimes it's just some of those days where you're like, I just don't want to do this. I have to do this. And then after like 30 minutes, I still don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you get into that hyper focus mode? Is there a recipe, or you just like, it ebbs and flows and you just have to like, just go with the flow, and sometimes it doesn't come and sometimes it does. How do you make that a bit more deterministic?
Yeah. So first I would say just recognize that like we are complex machinery. And so there is no button that we can push and be like, boom, we're in it, right? Some days it's hard and it's always hard. And on those days, it's less about getting into the state of hyperfocus and more about becoming the person who shows up regardless and does the work. And that's like an important aspect as well. But within this, there are things that we can do. Our goal is to prime the pump and prime the situation so that we have the best likelihood of going in the flow or into hyperfocus and staying there. And so there's some aspects of this to consider. One would be your physiological state, right? Like your physiological state, like hyperfocus and flow is a neurological state of being, right? And that is rooted in our chemistry. And so like at the end of the day, like we are just these squishy bags of juicy computer. And if we can understand what underlies the processes, then we can kind of prime things in our favor. So 3 things to really consider when it comes to getting into deep work is you have to control for your rest state, your active state, and then kind of like your recovery state. So those are like your sleep, your nutrition, and your exercise. Those things truly help because you're getting your body primed into an elevated state, getting your dopamine running, and those are always good things. So if you're struggling consistently to get and stay focused on things, number one, it could be your sleep. Like that's the main thing that I see is that people are just not getting enough sleep or enough good sleep. And so I would spend a lot of time really getting that dialed in because that alone is going to pay massive ramifications down the road. Second then is your exercise. Like moving your body and getting it active just keeps it so much easier to go into the flow state. And we know this, like an object at rest tends to stay at rest, an object in motion tends to stay in motion. Once you start getting momentum, like things become easier. And what's one of the interesting things about exercise for me is that, yeah, there's the physiological benefits of it, but more important I find are like the psychological cues of like, oh, I've done this thing. I've done this hard thing. And in my experience, the more you do hard things, the easier it becomes to do other hard things because you start to identify in your mind as like, I'm capable of doing this. I'm the type of person who can do hard things. And that's, I think exercise, fitness is really a gateway drug for everything else that we're going to talk about here. So I start with that and with sleep. And then nutrition, like this is one that I still struggle with, honestly, because I tend to like put a lot of garbage into my face. But like the times where I felt best in my life are when I have my eating and my nutrition on point. Like what goes in really defines what comes out. So that's one aspect is like your physiological state. If we can get that figured out, that's going to pay big dividends for hyperfocus. The second thing then is your environment design itself. Like if focus is really just the ability to resist distractions, like that's an easy way to define it, then we can make the game easier for ourselves by removing and eliminating distractions as much as possible. And so when it comes to environment design, I feel like we probably don't spend enough time thinking about how is my desk set up? How is my computer set up? How is, like my auditory stimulus? How is my visual stimulus? Am I sitting in front of a window? You'll notice like I have this big window to the side, but in front of me, it's just a blank wall, right? And so I'm not tempted to look over here because I'm looking here. I always have my noise canceling headphones right here next to me so that I can drown out any auditory noise. Because for me, the biggest distraction is always auditory. If there's a creak in the other room or something's happening, I get transported and I'm thinking about it. And then thinking about your sense of smell and thinking about your sense of touch. And these are things that you can control. If you look, I don't know if you guys can see it, but on my desk, I just have a bunch of candles over there. So I can control the olfactory sense of getting primed for being in a state. And I find that that's a really, really powerful one. I also got this stuff right here that I use pretty regularly called Boom Boom. So this is a cinnamon stick. And I also have one that's peppermint. And this is a really great way. You just take a quick hit of it, and I find that as part of like a focus ritual, this is a really good way to prime your physiology and say, we're going to start working now. And in the same way that like pro athletes never take the state or like never go onto the field without doing a warm up or going through a routine, same way that actors and performers, they all have a routine that they go through. I think there's a lot of value in establishing a focus routine, where you say like it's gonna be 5 to 10 minutes, very quick, with maybe some breath work. It could be some visual cue work where you're saying, okay, when I start to do my focus routine, then the other side of that means I'm ready and primed to work. And I find just that little bit right there can be really, really powerful. So we have our physiological state, we have our environment design, and then the last thing is the task itself. A lot of tasks are just by their nature very hard to get into a state of hyperfocus with. And so anything that we can do to manipulate that task, to gamify it, whether that's like trying to go for a high score or setting time limits on it, like anything that we can do to make that task inherently more engaging makes it so that we're more likely to actually go into the hyperfocus state with it. So those are just 3 things that I think about a lot in terms of like, what's my environment designed as? Where's my rest, my nutrition, my exercise state of being for my physiology, and then the task itself. What can I do to manipulate that thing to make it more fun?